Hello everyone, it's your author Nate, about to begin our first reading of The Adventures of Harriet Potter, hereafter known as AHP for short. Before we dive into it, however, I suppose it's probably a good idea to explain a bit of who I am, how this got started, and all that jazz. AHP was originally ideated by two of my very close friends, well introduced by their pseudonyms, Little Bitty Amelie and Night Miner, their DeviantArt handles. It was something they both started as Harry Potter fans back around 2009, 2010, I want to say. And they started as sort of a role-play game between them and a couple of other friends. I wasn't really part of it at that time, though I had known Amelie for a little bit before that. Anyway, after a while, they started realizing they had a decent idea for a story, and Amelie, knowing I was a writer, started pestering me into writing it. At first, I admit I really wasn't that interested. I loved writing, I have my entire life, but at the time I wanted to be more of a technical and historical writer. Writing fantasy, and especially fan fiction, was definitely not on my radar. Yes, I admit I was prior to this in the fan fiction is lame camp. But the more and more stuff they kept coming up with and showing to me and sending me, really the more interested I became. I guess I will digress a bit and say here, it's not that I have no interest at all in fictional genres like fantasy or sci-fi. I grew up reading the works of Tolkien and Frank Herbert, and I definitely enjoyed it. It just wasn't what I wanted to do, if you follow me. I also really hate up the Star Wars extended universe novels that were all the rage in the 90s, and yes, I do love Rey and Finn and the new Star Wars film so far, but the fact that they completely ejected the EU and made it no longer canon will always destroy me a little inside. No Jason and Jaina and Anakin, and no Mara Jade, especially no Mara Jade. No Nokri Death Commandos, and the amazingness that was Admiral Thrawn. Yes, I know they're in Rebels, but their inclusion now feels kind of shallow to me. If you if you follow me there. Anyway, okay, we're wandering a bit too much here, so I'm back on track. I will say I had also listened to, I should say, Harry Potter, not necessarily read it. Around 2008 to 2009, I started listening to the Stephen Fry audiobooks, and so I wouldn't say I went into this project totally blind as to the world. I appreciated Rowling's work for sure, and the way that it just made so many people happy even at its darkest moments, but I wouldn't say I was like a crazy fan. And I will say, I did also throughout my life, I've had like ideas for fantasy and sci-fi type novels and some historical fiction, but those had largely gone on back burner by that point, and I wasn't really thinking about them all until writing AHP began and really helped me rebuild my confidence as a writer. More on that, however, in next week's show, which will finally dive into Gods of Elf and Man. Moving on here, so as I was saying, I was still really wanting to write more factual fiction-y works about the turn of 2009, 2010, around in there. In the summer of 2010, I had written a piece on the Battle of Britain that really took off and had my blood boiling for writing inspiring but informative things. I remember I really wanted to write for Osprey Publishing Company, particularly their Aircraft of the Aces series and things like that. I am a huge aviation nut. Anyone who knows anything about me will understand that. I grew up playing the IL-2 Sturmovik series, Microsoft's Close Combat games. I really wanted to be a pilot, especially a fighter pilot. However, health and my eyesight really sort of put pain to those plans, unfortunately. So, yeah, that really kind of informed the stuff that I wanted to do. Anyway, bringing it back to AHP here again. This kind of comes to where, for the first time, I'll say that AHP quote-unquote saved my life, for want of a better term. I don't want to air too much dirty laundry, but around 2010 to 2011, I was in a terribly emotionally and mentally abusive relationship for a while, and it really kind of broke me as a person. I'll say at that point, I kind of started retreating from life, and I kind of retreated into the world of fantasy. It was kind of a nice little place to go and get away from things, and I got back out my old, the old Stephen Fry audiobooks, and, started listening to him, just mostly at first, just, he was a calming voice, and, but eventually I started really kind of listening more to the story and really started appreciating the Harry Potter world even more. And again, at around the same time, AHPY came back to me again, and, again approached me as a writer, like, do I want to do this, and, something to help me get back on my feet. And I still kind of had all the old little snippets I had written about it, and written of their, their stories and plays that they had brought to me, and finally said, okay, I guess I'll finally kind of give this a go. So I finally, I kind of started writing it, and the very first chapter was posted on June 6th of 2012. It's really can't believe it's been that long. And from there, let's say AHP became my freedom, so to speak. It was a world where I could escape and create and at the same time be part of something that, inspired people all over again. It was where I could take people down paths that were maybe familiar to them, but it could show them in a brand new way with new lights and perspectives maybe people hadn't thought of before. Different ways to look at things. Like how would Snape react to a daughter of Lily's compared to a son's? Would it change how, Lord Voldemort reacts and treats the main character? What new people might she encounter and become friends with compared to what Harry did? Maybe she would pay more attention to the wider magical world and be more curious about it. And what new things could we look at from the wider magical world and implement in, and things like that. So, as I said, so this year, June 6th will be the 7th anniversary. As of this moment, as of this recording, around 11 a.m. on February 13th, 2019, AHP has tallied up about 137,000 views on DeviantArt amongst its chapters, and is a bit over 1,100,000 words long. So it's already broken past the actual canon length. The longest so far is year 4, with the most read being year 3, which I suppose is logical, seeing as for most people, Prisoner of Azkaban was their favorite. At present, we're somewhere between halfway and 2/3 of the way into year 5. I'll say the series is also available on fanfiction.net and an archive of our own, or AO3, where it's also getting substantial followings. It's up to about 750,000 cumulative views on fanfiction and 38,000 views on AO3, but in fairness, I didn't start posting it on AO3 until late 2014, almost 2015, so about 2.5 years into the series already, so it's got a little bit of catching up to do there. Now, before we begin in earnest with the storytelling, I do have some warnings up front about AHP. It is definitely from the outset meant for a more mature audience. And I don't mean like gore and blood and violence and sex, at least not in an exploitive manner. But I did try to deal with issues that kids and teens deal with that society likes to pretend that they don't. So Harriet goes through things like puberty and starts feeling things for other characters earlier than Harry does, for instance. The focus is always really on what would happen, rather than intentionally toning things down. This was because I figured that, my audience would largely be the people who grew up with HP, with Harry Potter, but we're now grown, and these were issues that they could more likely handle. It's not really It's not really meant for, I guess, a new audience, though I would really appreciate hearing a bit more perspectives of people who hadn't read the canon series. I know that's maybe asking a lot, but another thing with compared to the original is I really, really worked hard to give Harriet more of a personality as opposed to Harry. Harry is definitely more of an everyman sort of character. Not that he's not interesting, but he can come across as kind of bland and dry compared to what I tried to do with Harriet. Like, Harry is a sort of hero where you're very clearly supposed to be able to project yourself onto him. And I wanted Harriet to be more like someone we could know. Like, she's her own person. She's someone we could be friends with rather than we could be ourselves. And at the same time, it makes her feel more real, I think. And you can empathize with her a little better, and even to the extent that you can start going, well, this is someone who is dealing with similar issues to myself, and if they can be this hero, then I can be this hero too. And that's really something that I tried to bring to this series, and I hope that comes across. Most people have said I've been successful in that endeavor, so that's good. But maybe now with this, I'll be reaching a newer audience, and we'll see what you all think. So without any further ado, I guess to use the cliche, let's begin. First of all, I'd like to thank Miss Rowling for the wonderful and crazy world that she's made that allowed me to branch out and find my own footing again as a writer. It really means everything to me, and I will always be in your debt. I also, for very the same, I want to thank Little Bitty Emily and Night Miner for giving me the same thing. You guys, this really changed my life, and I don't know what I'd be doing right now. I wouldn't have met so many great people. I wouldn't have made I wouldn't have met my best friend Taylor or anything like that. So it's just thank you so much to you guys, and thanks to everyone who's read so far and made this what it is. For those of you who follow along in the Patreon versions, I'll talk a bit about some of the behind the scenes stuff and how we didn't really when this project was all really getting started, there was a lot of stuff we admittedly didn't take quite as seriously. And there's a lot of stuff that ended up, when I started putting out the definitive editions of the first years, that ended up getting cut because it was things we were just kind of screwing around with early on, that we realized, people are really sort of jumping on the bandwagon with this. We better clean this up a little bit and make this a bit more of a passable story. Anyway, secondly here, after that, another big digression. All characters and locations, unless otherwise stated, are the sole property of J.K. Rowling. At the end I will end each episode with a proper crediting of the characters who are not otherwise canon. Characters and locations and entities and things like that. So now, with that all out of the way, I thank you for listening along, and here we go. Let us launch right into Year 1. The Adventures of Harriet Potter, Year 1, Chapter 1, The Violinist. Nothing is ever as it appears. Ever does both preconception and experience color perception. We cannot avoid them, but we can all better serve ourselves by being aware of their influence. General Retired Jigme Dorji Wanshuk. The sound of voices filled the open area in front of the large building. The din was so loud almost nothing else could be heard but the sound of the cars that bustled by in the crowded streets and streamed in and out of the parking lot. Throughout Paddington Station, the guards grumbled to themselves at the absurd levels of people pouring into the station. The veteran guards, of course, were prepared for it, as it was always like this on the 1st of September, though none of them could think of why. The station was packed with crowds of travelers and commuters, but there were others who were at best difficult to ignore. They were often family groups with luggage, but that, of course, was normal enough. It was the presence of odd pets like owls and the strange way the adults dressed that caught the most attention. Not only that, but every one of the oddly dressed, owl-owning families were heading on to King's Cross rather than Paddington itself. It was hardly surprising then, in this influx of strangely dressed families with odd pets, that no one noticed the woebegone figure as he made his way to a spot to the side of the platforms 9 and 10 of King's Cross. He was wearing a roughed and ragged coat that came down to his ankles and could have once been blue, but now seemed a faded gray, and a wide-brimmed hat which covered most of his face in shadow. He set a small cup on the floor and took a long-stemmed pipe from his pocket. He filled it slowly and lit it with a match. He then took a few long puffs and sighed, reveling the smoky flavor. He leaned back against the wall and looked around at the still bustling scene as he puffed on his pipe. His eyes were keen and bright as he took in the passing travelers. In particular, he seemed most interested in the strangely dressed families. Unlike the guards, it wasn't the odd clothes that seemed to interest him. Instead, his interest seemed focused on the owls and the faces of their young owners. It seemed more as though he was looking for someone in particular rather than idle curiosity. However, he seemed to be finding it difficult to separate the individuals from the other passengers, and he chewed the stem of his pipe in apparent frustration. The man shifted in his seat, and as if from nowhere produced a violin and bow. He looked it over carefully, almost worshipful, as he tested the tightness of the strings. Its surface was heavily scratched, and the varnish was splotchy and uneven. He played a few hollow notes as he tuned it, and several passers-by rolled their eyes or gave him disdainful looks as he passed. He took another puff on his pipe before he set it down and put the violin into the crook of his neck and set the bow to the strings. He didn't play at first. He merely closed his eyes and took a deep and reverent breath, as if just the position of holding the violin, ready to perform, was almost as moving to him as the actual performance. Finally, his bow sprang to life, sliding delicately and expertly over the strings, his fingers dancing on the neck as he played. Most of the passers-by paid him no mind, and he played on, just as oblivious to them in return. However, his music seemed irresistible to the families in cloaks, who would often pause to listen, and even throw the occasional small bronze or silver coin into the cup, which, despite its small size, never seemed to get full. The ragged violinist played on, changing fluidly between simple folk tunes and the stringed pieces of symphonies. His eyes sparkled as he played, intently watching the families that came up to him to listen, studying them all as they approached to place coins into the cup. Suddenly, he glanced up and paused, almost like a conductor who heard a wrong note amongst the orchestra. There was another family approaching. A large, beefy, neckless man with a bushy mustache was in the lead. Following behind was a long-necked, horse-faced woman and a portly boy. The boy, in particular, seemed slightly anxious, eyeing everyone nervously, and walking as if trying to keep anyone from seeing his enormous backside. The only other odd thing about the family was a trunk on a trolley, which seemed to be following them of its own volition. The ragged violinist's eyes narrowed as he watched, but he finally smiled as the last member of the group came into view. It was a young girl who the chubby son had wholly blocked from sight. By the way she was following with her trunk, it seemed as if she'd been ordered to do so to keep the rotund boy's backside hidden. He noted that despite her diminutive size compared to him, the son didn't seem all that happy with the walking arrangement, as though he was terrified of the girl who stood a head shorter than him. The violinist grinned more broadly as he noted that atop the trunk was a sizable birdcage, and within was a large snowy owl. He returned his attention to the girl. She looked to be around 11 years old. Her hair was black, slightly untidy, shoulder-length, and covered most of her face as she nervously followed the other three. She was thin, with knobbly knees, and wore raggedy second-hand clothing. The glint of glasses was just visible through her fringe. The violinist finally resumed playing, but changed his tune yet again, playing a more whimsical score. The girl paused while the remainder of her family kept heading into King's Cross. She considered him and started walking closer slowly, curiosity showing in her bright green eyes, which were prominent even through her glasses and thick black hair. As she approached, the violinist smiled to himself and spoke. "It's dangerous getting separated from your family in this day and age, you know," he said, just loud enough for her to hear him over the crowds behind her. His voice was gravelly, as if rarely used, thick and rough, though of a somewhat precise and calculated tone, clearly meant as a reprimand. The girl blushed softly at the violinist's reproach. They're not my family. Well, I mean, not that kind of family," she admitted. The violinist nodded and played a few more bars as the girl drew out a small pouch. "Still, best be catching up with him," he went on while he played. The girl pondered him for a moment, then looked around at the others going into the station, stepping aside as a woman in a cloak stopped to put a couple more silver coins in his cup. "How come so few people notice you?" the girl asked as the woman walked away. "You're incredible, but it's like some people can't even hear you." The violinist chuckled and tilted his head to peer up at her from under the brim of his hat and winked. "Magic." The girl pondered him a few more moments before she finally reached into the pouch, drew out 2 large golden coins, and bent down to drop them into the cup. He kept his head tilted just enough to note the peculiar lightning-shaped scar on her forehead. At the same time, she finally looked into his face and seemed a little surprised to see him looking at her. She jumped as a loud voice behind her bellowed, "Girl!" It was the large man who'd led the group. "Get away from that riffraff! We haven't got all day!" "Sorry," the girl called, heading it off after the man, who gave the violinist a scathing, skeptical look before turning back into King's Cross. The violinist pondered after them a moment or two, before picking up his pipe again and relighting it. "So, that's the girl who lived, eh?" he muttered under his breath, chewing the pipe stem. The violin had vanished as suddenly as it appeared. The violinist got to his feet, dusted himself off, and blew a smoke ring before he headed off towards the nearby alleyway. He hung his head, deep in thought, casually puffing on the pipe as he reached the alley. The violinist glanced over his shoulder, chuckling when he saw the fat, necklace man leading a guard back outside. The fat man was looking incredulously at the area where the violinist had just been sitting. The guard rolled his eyes in frustration, leaving the fat man to rant on about riffraff and strange folk. The violinist shook his head in amusement and finally stepped into the alley. He drew a long, thin, wooden wand, shaped somewhat like a violin bow, from his coat pocket. He raised it, but paused to turn around again as a deep, though friendly voice piped up. "Ah, so here you are, Sherrod. What brings you here so far from home?" asked the man who'd just stepped into the alleyway behind the violinist. The violinist chuckled, doffed his hat, bowing to the newcomer. The newcomer was tall and very old, with waist-length white hair and a beard, and half-moon spectacles. He was wearing midnight blue robes and a tall pointed hat. "Ah, and a good morning to you, Elvis. As for my presence, let's just call it some scouting, as you might say," said Sherrod. His voice was changed now, still thick and gruff, but less gravelly, with a hint of laughter in it. "Scouting?" asked Dumbledore, striding into the alley as his piercing blue eyes surveyed the younger man thoughtfully. Sherrod chuckled in a good-natured way and nodded, putting his hat back on. "Oh yes, Albus. You don't think you're the only one with a vested interest in the girl's future and safety, do you? Or that of the Wizarding Worlds?" Albus took a few steps closer. "Sherrod, you do recall our discussion on this from 10 years ago, I'm sure," he said, though in a hardly threatening tone, more that of a parent reminding a precocious teenager of the house rules. "Oh yes, I remember," Sherrod replied and nodded. "I was simply interested in seeing just what sort of a person young Miss Potter had grown into under your watch, Albus." Sherrod looked up and smiled warmly at the older man. "You were right, as always, Albus," Sherrod said, conceding. "She has grown into an outstanding young woman. You can tell that within a minute of talking to her. Modest and very intuitive, despite the obviously rough life she has led. It does build one's character, I suppose," he said, drawing out the 2 galleons that the young girl had put into his cup. "She knew I was a wizard. She took out her pouch of wizarding money right away. Granted, given her family, I'm assuming, rather safely, I'm sure, it's the only money she does possess." He paused and contemplated the galleons. "She could have given me sickles or knuts, but she gave me 2 galleons. I'm sure this would be most helpful to our scholarship students. Every bit helps," he went on, repocketing the galleons. Dumbledore chuckled, and the 2 men strode towards each other, clasping their hands tightly and beaming broadly in a sincerely heartfelt greeting. "I'm glad you approve, Sherrod," Albus said as they broke the hand clasp and patted the younger man on the shoulder. "It was all a gamble, but she has indeed developed into a most engaging child. Arabella has kept me informed of her progress growing up." "Old Figgy!" exclaimed Sherrod, smiling. "So you've had her watching out for our little survivor, eh?" "Oh yes," replied Dumbledore. "She has proved most useful, even if, alas, she has been required to help in keeping Harriet's lot as unenviable as possible, though her family necessitated that, unfortunately. How's her grandniece doing, incidentally? She's a dancer, I believe. A magnificent dancer. Do tell Arabelle I said so personally, won't you? I most certainly will, Albus replied, smiling merrily. How are you, Sherrod? How goes the running of Rathlin? Ah, my life bides fine. It's business as usual, truth be told. Theater students badgering art majors, primary students running amok. Managing 1,600 students is no small order, after all. No, I shouldn't think so, even for a headmaster as youthful and talented as yourself, said Dumbledore, nodding. Sherrod bowed and smiled roguishly. And what about you in Hogwarts? Sherrod asked in return. Oh, it has been par the course these past 10 years, though I am sure now young Miss Potter is joining our student body that is about to change dramatically, Dumbledore replied wistfully. Sherrod suddenly looked more severe, and his eyes darted around as if looking for an eavesdropper. I have information, Albus. It's the reason I was here checking on Harriet as she got to the station. I mean, only her family for protection, away from her aunt and uncle's house. It was where she was most vulnerable. I'm sure you heard about Gringotts. Of course, said Dumbledore, listening intently. The item isn't safe anymore, not at Hogwarts. He's on the move. He has left his nest, and he's found another to do his bidding, according to the High Council. Neither is Harriet safe. Keep on your guard this year, Albus, and keep Severus on the alert as well. That's all the information I can give for now. Dark times are coming, even if the girl who lived is finally learning and walking her true path. Albus nodded, digesting the information. Thank you, Sherrod. I was sure something like that would happen. That's why I had to move from Gringotts, in just the nick of time, it seems. Yes, I will give the stone every defense necessary, and Harriet as well. Indeed, you may even want to consider Harriet herself might be a defense against that which we fear most. Sherrod nodded thoughtfully, before changing the subject. How are Nicholas and Perenelle, by the way? He asked vacantly, still deep in thought. Oh, fine as ever for people of their rather considerable age, Dumbledore replied, chuckling. Their second youngest umpteenth great-grandchild, Dora, starts Hogwarts this year. Dumbledore went on, smiling. Ah, yes. So their youngest Emma will start in 2 years, then? Indeed. Though we will certainly lament the loss of young Miss Martinez, she was an incredibly promising talent, Sherrod said, giving Dumbledore a slightly reproving look. Dumbledore merely chuckled. Ah, Sherrod, time and again this happens. It is ever so unfair of you to keep holding it against me that students leave from your primary to come to Hogwarts instead of continuing to your academy. We do not have a primary school of our own to compete. I'm sure Miss Martinez will prove an incredibly capable witch as well as a dancer and singer. Hogwarts will most certainly not steal that love and joy of art you and your staff work so hard to nurture, Dumbledore said with a soft chuckle. Sherrod grimaced before changing the subject. There's more news, Dumbledore. Again, nothing I'm sure you haven't heard, but just in case you are aware of the situation going on across the pond. Dumbledore nodded gravely. Yes, I have heard rumblings. It's quickly becoming far more than rumblings. We're getting pretty regular updates, particularly as we've had several American families pull their children from the school over this fiasco. They're on the verge of all-out warfare. The American wizarding government is preparing to mobilize, and several states are poised to try and secede. Does no one pay attention to history in that damn place? Sherrod went on, muttering the last sentence starkly and waving his hand vaguely to the west. Dumbledore sighed. No, leastways not to Muggle history, at any rate. Should war break out, it will be difficult to keep contained. This will be like nothing we've ever seen in a long time. This won't be anything like Voldemort. There won't be anything secretive about this. This won't be coup and cunning. This will be all-out warfare. This will be something even more dangerous, a war between two sides who believe they are completely in the right. We need to be ready, Albus. And Fudge must be prepared for the fallout should a civil war in the states break out. Because we will feel the effects here, make no mistake. Dumbledore nodded, putting a reassuring hand on the younger man's shoulder. I shall speak to the minister as soon as possible on what I assure you is our shared concern, Sherrod. You have my word. Sherrod exhaled in relief and took a few more puffs on his pipe before pulling out a watch with hands consisting of planets. Well, then, I must be back off to Rathlin. It's our first day back as well. Ah, how time flies over the summer. Shall I give my regards to Watkins for you? You may indeed, nodded Dumbledore, smiling and clasping Sherrod's hands in his again. I do so miss his spirited performances. Sherrod chuckled. Oh yes, I'm sure he'd appreciate being able to integrate Fawkes into a future performance again as well. Well then, have a good term, Albus. I will pass along whatever information I can as it comes to me, and please be sure to do the same. It will be difficult, but we may be able to hold him off again. The two broke their handshake and took a step back, sighing as two dear friends parting far too soon after too long apart. "Oh, one last thing, Albus," said Sherrod in sudden afterthought. "Yes, my dear man?" asked Albus. "How did you know it was me?" Dumbledore chuckled, and his eyes twinkled a little over the half-moon spectacles as his mustache quivered in a smile. "My dear Sherrod, only the esteemed headmaster of Rathlin's School of the Arts, and magic, of course, possesses a violin that is only audible to whomever its possessor wishes to hear it. And I could not help but notice a few of your own breathtaking compositions sneaking in as well between the Beethovens and the Bachs and the playful ditties," Dumbledore chortled. Sherrod smiled, and without another word, doffed his hat again, bowed low, and swept the ground with it before disappearing with a loud crack. Dumbledore chuckled softly, turning and looking back towards King's Cross. "Have a pleasant trip, Harriet. I shall see you at Hogwarts," he said under his breath before he, too, vanished with a loud crack.